Breaking, Canada just did the unthinkable, and Washington didn't see it coming. A moment ago, this could still be described as tension. Now it must be described as rupture. Canada has, by all appearances, decided that the age of quiet endurance is over, and that the trade confrontation associated with Donald Trump is no longer something to be absorbed, managed, or politely negotiated around. It is something to be answered. And that answer, if the title before us captures the true scale of what has just occurred, is not merely a policy adjustment. It is a strategic declaration. It is the unmistakable sound of a close ally deciding that restraint has reached its limit, that proximity is no protection, and that interdependence without respect is simply a more sophisticated form of vulnerability.
This is why the significance of this moment extends far beyond tariffs, customs schedules, or the immediate choreography of retaliation. The public headline suggests a bilateral dispute. The deeper reality suggests something far more consequential, a frontal collision between political power and economic structure, between old assumptions of continental unity and a new, harsher understanding of leverage. If Canada has indeed pulled the trigger in Trump's trade fight, then what we are witnessing is not just a reaction, it is a reclassification of the relationship itself. A country that has spent decades anchoring its prosperity, security, and diplomatic posture to the logic of stable U.S. partnership is signaling that stability can no longer be presumed. That is the real story, not disagreement but disillusionment, not a quarrel but a strategic awakening. And that is precisely why U.S. officials would be stunned, not because Canada lacks the ability to respond, and not because retaliation is conceptually surprising in a trade conflict, but because Washington has long been conditioned to believe that Canada, of all countries, would remain within the architecture of predictability.
Canada is supposed to be the quiet constant, the disciplined neighbor, the dependable ally that calibrates rather than escalates, that cushions rather than confronts. If that assumption has just been shattered, then the shock inside the American system would not be about one decision alone. It would be about the collapse of an entire hierarchy of expectations. Because when even Canada begins to behave as though the United States is not merely a partner but a source of strategic risk, the meaning of the event changes instantly. The issue ceases to be trade policy, it becomes trust. That distinction matters because trust is the hidden currency of geopolitical order. Alliances do not function on sentiment, they function on confidence that power will be exercised within understood limits. Markets do not thrive because geography is convenient, they thrive because rules are credible, institutions are durable, and major actors do not routinely weaponize dependence for domestic political theater. The moment one side demonstrates that access to its market can be turned into a coercive instrument at will, every connected state begins recalculating, quietly at first, then visibly, then irreversibly. So if Canada has moved from caution to confrontation, it tells us something profound about how far the internal logic of American trade aggression may have traveled. It has crossed a threshold. It has stopped looking temporary. It has started looking structural. That is the broader thesis tonight. This is not simply Canada responding to Trump. It is a middle power responding to the normalization of American economic unpredictability. And in that sense, Canada is not acting at the margins of the story. Canada is standing at the center of it. Because there are few relationships in the world more integrated, more historically familiar, more commercially intertwined, or more diplomatically taken for granted than the one between Ottawa and Washington. If stress at this level now produces open strategic retaliation, then every other U.S. partner is watching with sharpened attention. Europe is watching, Asia is watching, financial markets are watching, supply chains are watching, and above all, every government that depends on the American system while fearing its political volatility is watching. What makes the moment even more consequential is the contrast between the visible trigger and the invisible consequence. The visible trigger is a trade move. The invisible consequence is institutional erosion. That is always how these episodes work. The headline is immediate, measurable, dramatic. A tariff here, a countermeasure there, a meeting postponed, a statement issued, a market reaction registered. But the real damage unfolds elsewhere, beneath the surface, in the mental adjustments of decision makers and investors who begin asking harder questions. Can this relationship still be trusted under political stress? Can cross-border exposure still be treated as a strength? Can long-term industrial planning survive short-term populist disruption? Those questions do not vanish when the cameras turn away. They become embedded in strategy. And once that happens, happens, the consequences outlast the personalities who triggered them. There is also a deeper irony here, and it deserves emphasis. Trade fights are often presented to the public as hard-nosed demonstrations of sovereignty, as proof that a country is willing to defend itself against unfairness, dependency, or decline. But when such fights erupt inside a tightly integrated economic space, sovereignty does not expand cleanly, it fragments. It becomes more theatrical in politics and more constrained in practice. A blow aimed at a neighbor ricochets through domestic industries, regional employment, consumer prices, investor confidence, and national planning. It imposes pain not only on the target, but on the system that made both sides prosperous. So when Canada decides to answer force with force, the move is not evidence that the old framework remains healthy. It is evidence that the old framework is under enough strain that governments now accept mutual damage as the price of defending strategic credibility. And credibility is the central battlefield, because this is not just about what Canada is doing. It is about what Canada is refusing to be seen doing. It is refusing to be seen absorbing pressure indefinitely, refusing to be seen as too dependent to resist. Refusing to be seen as the pliable partner in a relationship defined by asymmetry, that matters immensely in international politics, where perception often precedes policy. If Ottawa concludes that absorbing punishment invites more punishment, then retaliation becomes more than an economic measure. It becomes a political necessity, a statement to Washington, yes, but also to domestic audiences, allied capitals in global markets. Canada still possesses agency. Canada still has instruments. Canada is not simply an extension of American economic will. This is where the title's phrasing becomes especially potent. Pulls the trigger is the language of finality, of crossing from warning into action. It suggests that the long phase of signaling has ended. The consultations, the diplomatic patience, the carefully worded objections, the bureaucratic rituals of de-escalation, those belong to an earlier chapter. The current chapter is harder, sharper, more dangerous, because once retaliation begins, both sides are no longer arguing about whether a line exists. They are testing who can redraw it. And history tells us that trade confrontations become most volatile, not when one side acts, but when both sides begin treating economic pain as politically useful evidence of resolve. That dynamic is particularly combustible when Donald Trump is part of the equation. Trump's approach to trade has never been merely technical. It has always been symbolic, theatrical, and ideologically charged. In that worldview, tariffs are not just policy tools, they are declarations of will. They convert complexity into confrontation. They transform structural economic debates into emotionally legible stories about strength, betrayal, and national recovery. The problem, of course, is that once politics is framed that way, compromise begins to look like weakness, and allied concern begins to look like disloyalty. In such an environment, even highly rational economic relationships can become captive to political narratives that reward escalation more than resolution. Canada, however, does not have the luxury of responding emotionally. That is what makes its entry into open trade confrontations so significant. For Ottawa, the stakes are existential in a different way. The United States is not simply a rival market, it is the dominant gravitational force in Canada's economic universe. To challenge Washington openly is therefore not an act of impulse, it is an act of calculated risk. Which means that if Canada has chosen this route, it likely reflects a sober conclusion that the cost of silence now exceeds the cost of retaliation. That is an extraordinary threshold for any country to cross in relation to the United States. For Canada, it is seismic, and once that threshold is crossed, the implications widen rapidly. Because the first consequence of trade conflict is disruption, but the second consequence is adaptation. Companies reprice risk, governments accelerate diversification, political coalitions change their language, bureaucracies once organized around integration begin preparing for insulation. None of that happens overnight, and much of it remains invisible during the first wave of headlines. But this is how strategic landscapes shift, not always through war, not always through treaties, but through repeated episodes of coercion that teach states to reduce exposure. If that learning process is now underway in Canada, the long-term effect could be far larger than the immediate dispute. It could mark the slow, strategic uncoupling of assumptions that North America has relied upon for generations. Consider the psychological dimension.
For decades, one of America's greatest advantages was not merely its scale, but the confidence others had in aligning with it. Access to the U.S. market, proximity to U.S. market, capital, integration with U.S. production, and partnership with U.S. institutions were all seen as stabilizing assets. That perception multiplied American power. It made alliance economically rewarding and strategically rational. But when a major ally begins to act as though closeness itself can be weaponized against it, that advantage starts to corrode. Not all at once, not dramatically in every data point, but steadily in capital allocation decisions, in political debates, in national resilience planning, and in the quiet but decisive shift from dependency to hedging. This is why the stunned reaction inside Washington, if accurate, may itself reveal the depth of the problem. Surprise is often less about the action than about the assumption that made the action seem impossible. If officials are truly stunned, then they may have underestimated how deeply the logic of coercive trade politics had penetrated Allied thinking. They may have mistaken Canadian restraint for Canadian tolerance. They may have believed that institutional familiarity would continue to override strategic injury. That would be a serious misreading, because the strongest alliances often appear stable right up until the moment accumulated grievance becomes impossible to disguise. And when that moment comes, the response is often more forceful precisely because it has been delayed. There is another layer here, and it concerns the nature of power in the 21st century. Hard power still matters, military capability still matters, but increasingly, power is exercised through systems, through payments, logistics, regulation, supply chains, standards, and access. The great contest of modern statecraft is not only who can compel through force, but who can shape the conditions under which others prosper. Trade policy sits directly inside that contest. So when a major economic relationship becomes openly adversarial, what is being contested is not just price or market share, it is the architecture of influence itself. Who gets to define the rules? Who bears the adjustment costs? Who can impose uncertainty without suffering equivalent strategic blowback? In that sense, Canada's move is significant, not because it makes Canada suddenly equal to the United States in raw power. It does not. That is not the point. The point is that asymmetry does not erase leverage. Smaller powers can still impose costs, generate political pressure, challenge legitimacy, and expose the vulnerabilities of a larger actor's strategy. They can make domination expensive, they can complicate narratives of effortless strength, and they can demonstrate, especially to third parties, that the dominant power is encountering resistance even within its inner circle. That matters enormously in global politics because prestige is inseparable from authority. When the center cannot command confidence from the closest perimeter, the wider system begins asking what that means. And what it may mean is this: the era in which the United States could assume automatic strategic deference from its allies is narrowing, not ending completely, not collapsing overnight, but narrowing. Conditionality is replacing certainty. Transactional pressure is generating strategic doubt. States that once treated American leadership as the fixed axis of their planning are increasingly forced to distinguish between the United States as security guarantor, the United States as economic partner, and the United States as political variable. That fragmentation is dangerous because it erodes coherence. Allies begin compartmentalizing. They cooperate in one sphere while protecting themselves in another. They remain aligned but less trusting, integrated but less open, loyal but less dependent. That is how systems hollow out before they visibly break. The institutions remain, the treaties remain, the diplomatic language remains, but the internal confidence that gave those structures meaning begins to thin. And once that confidence thins, every future shock becomes harder to absorb. Every election matters more. Every tariff threat carries more weight. Every internal political oscillation inside the dominant power radiates wider instability. That is why this moment deserves to be treated as historically significant. Because if Canada, one of the most institutionally embedded partners the United States has ever had, now feels compelled to answer Trump's trade fight in a way that shocks Washington, then the old model of North American inevitability has been damaged. And damage to inevitability is no small thing.
Modern power rests heavily on expectation. Markets move on expectation. Diplomacy relies on expectation. Supply chains, investment cycles, defense planning, and public reassurance all depend on what leaders believe will probably hold. The moment that probability weakens, behavior changes, risk premiums rise, contingency planning expands, political rhetoric hardens. Even if a future deal is reached, even if a compromise is crafted, even if the immediate confrontation cools, the memory of the shock remains. Canada will remember that the United States could press this far. The United States will remember that Canada was willing to strike back, and all future negotiations will take place in the shadow of that memory. This also carries domestic implications on both sides of the border. In the United States, trade conflict is often sold as strategic toughness, but toughness is not measured only by the ability to initiate pressure. It is measured by the ability to control the consequences of pressure. If Allied retaliation begins inflicting visible political or economic costs, then the domestic story changes. The image of unilateral strength starts colliding with the reality of mutual disruption. In Canada, meanwhile, retaliation can consolidate political legitimacy by turning vulnerability into resolve. It can transform a position of exposure into one of national assertion. Yet that too has a price. It raises expectations. It commits the government to endurance. It makes backing down more difficult because the issue is no longer only commercial. It becomes national. That is why trade fights between close partners are so dangerous. They do not stay technical for long. They become moralized. One side frames the conflict as defense against exploitation. The other frames it as defense against coercion. Soon the numbers matter less than the narrative. Soon each concession looks like surrender. Soon every compromise requires leaders to explain not merely what they gained, but why they were forced into the contest at all. That is how economically manageable disputes become politically explosive ones. And when politics takes command, strategic flexibility narrows fast. What should the world take from this tonight? For that, check for you, it's not enough to preserve alignment. Second, that economic integration without political predictability can become a liability rather than a shield. Third, that allies are now far more willing to treat market access, industrial dependence, and supply chain concentration as national security questions. This is the larger transformation of our era. The boundary between economics and strategy is dissolving. Trade is no longer just about efficiency. It is about resilience, coercion, autonomy, and control. In that world, the Canadian move against Trump's trade war is not a side story. It is a case study in how the global order is being rewired under pressure, and the pressure is cumulative. One dispute by itself can be absorbed. One round of tariffs can be negotiated around. One burst of nationalist rhetoric can be dismissed as political spectacle. But repeated confrontations produce doctrine that teach governments what assumptions are no longer safe. They push bureaucracies towards structural reform. They invite industry to seek alternative corridors, alternative suppliers, alternative futures. The immediate event may have occurred in North America, but the lesson will travel globally. If even the most intimate trading relationships are now vulnerable to coercive volatility, then strategic redundancy is no longer optional, it is policy. There is finally a question of timing. Moments like this are rarely isolated from larger historical currents. They appear sudden, but they are often the visible crest of deeper movement. Years of resentment, mistrust, political reorientation, and institutional fatigue finally reaching expression. That is why the language of 1 minute ago feels so dramatic and yet so fitting. Events like this always seem abrupt in the instant they break, but their significance lies in what they confirm, not merely what they announce. They confirm that something once thought durable has become contestable. They confirm that Allied patience has strategic limits. They confirm that the post-Cold War assumption of seamless liberal economic integration is giving way to a harder, more suspicious age. So no, this is not a routine trade dispute. It is not a temporary flare-up to be filed away as another episode in the noisy churn of modern politics. It is a warning signal from within the Western economic core. It is a reminder that power, when used without enough regard for trust, eventually compels even the closest partners to defend themselves in ways that alter the system for everyone. Canada's move, whatever its precise form, matters because it speaks in the language of strategic consequence. It says that the costs of submission have risen too high. It says that the politics of pressure are beginning to erode the architecture they claim to defend. And it says that Washington may no longer be able to assume that alliance proximity and habit will absorb every shock it chooses to create. What comes next will matter enormously. Markets may calm, diplomats may improvise, officials may insist that channels remain open and that a framework for de-escalation still exists. Perhaps it does, but the deeper shift has already taken place. A threshold of perception has been crossed. Canada is no longer simply reacting within a familiar dispute. It is acting within a changed understanding of the relationship. And once relationships are reinterpreted through the lens of risk, coercion, and strategic self-protection, the consequences do not arrive all at once, they arrive in waves. That is the true significance of this moment. Not merely that Canada has answered, but that it has answered in a way that reveals how much the underlying order has changed. Not merely that U.S. officials are stunned, but that they were still capable of being stunned. The age of automatic assumptions is ending. A colder arithmetic is taking its place. And if this confrontation is indeed the opening phase of that new arithmetic, then the story now unfolding between Canada and the United States will not be remembered as a passing clash over trade. It will be remembered as one of those rare moments when a headline exposed a deeper fracture, when an apparently narrow dispute illuminated a much larger transformation already underway, and when the consequences, still gathering beyond the horizon, had only just begun to arrive.